As you may know, we were supposed to have a stand-up comedian here today, and we had to quickly pivot. We're lucky to have a pinch hitter that's better than the starter, and I'd like to now introduce our speaker today, our own Dr. Michael Simpson. He is a BA from Fordham College, a PhD from Tufts, an MBA from Syracuse. He is the former president of American University of Paris, as well as the International Space University. He was the executive director of the Secure World Foundation and is the current managing director of the International Institute of Space Commerce. Dr. Michael Simpson, I will say this, my son is going to be watching this because he is infatuated with space, and I promised him I would show this later, so let's keep it G-rated, okay?
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Okay, so you were expecting a comedian. It's okay if you have to laugh at what I have to say from time to time. But change is sometimes funny. And we're in the middle of one of the most interesting changes in the local economy of planet Earth that we have seen in my lifetime. And that is the real emergence of authentic, closable business plans that deal with space assets to meet the needs of the only real market that we have for the time being for any assets. And that, of course, is those of us here on planet Earth. I've wanted to talk to you about space commerce for a while because there's been an enormous amount of publicity recently about launches and billionaires going to space, a little less publicity about the fact that they've empowered people like Wally Funk to get to space when the way we treated women in the early 60s made it impossible to recognize that although Wally Funk had passed every astronaut test, she was, by reason of gender, disqualified from being one of the Mercury astronauts. I mean, let's be frank about that. That's the only reason she was not one of the Mercury astronauts. She went to space because a commercial company decided, yes, this would be a great publicity stunt, but with the right person. So were they right for the wrong reasons or the right reasons? Not too much of a concern to me. Wally Funk got to space where she should have gotten in the 1960s. It just took almost 50 years. Space commerce is in fact not new. It's getting a lot of publicity because, look, we have the chance to maybe see a billionaire blow himself up. But make no mistake about it, that is part of the reason you've seen so much coverage of what's going on. There's a real chance for a hysterical opportunity here. But ComSat went public as a public company with private customers in addition to government customers in 1963. It was using some very rudimentary satellite technology, but it was remarkable because in 1963, we were only 15 years beyond when Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, had written a nonfiction paper that said, you know, it's possible to use geosynchronous orbit and create communications around the world. 15 years later, that idea is incorporated in a business plan. So understand this is not all brand new, it's just accelerating now. And for those of you who've got a vague idea from your past math understanding of exponential functions, we've hit the knee in the exponential function. That is, we are beginning to see a very rapid increase in what people are doing with what we've been learning about space for over 60 years, at least, of the space era. So let's take a look at some of the segments of space activity that are getting an enormous amount of private interest. And by private interest, I don't just mean curiosity, I mean hard cash. People willing to put money on the line where they can lose money. You know, that's sort of part of what an investment's involved with. Yeah, this way you get warned every time you make an investment. You know, you could lose past performance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So SATCOM, satellite communications, is the oldest sector with a private commercial market. And it has been growing very rapidly. Interestingly, from a political standpoint, there are people who argue that one of the reasons that the opposition to the Vietnam War was able to get such energy behind it was that SATCOM for the first time made it possible to see warfare sites in near real time. Because somebody could take the picture in Vietnam, broadcast it to a satellite, it's in New York, it's distributed all over the country. Some people weren't happy about that. But the reality was it's changed our life. It's changed the way we deal with things. It's in effect, as Plato would have told you, it's pulled us out of the cave. We're not just looking at the shadows anymore. This is about a $60 billion market. It may be hugely larger depending on how you calculate it. And so first caveat when thinking about space commerce is that the numbers are still eluding us in terms of how big the industries are. Why? Well, it's $60 billion in market, but should that include all the billings of satellite broadcasters to private homes? Well, doesn't that also include terrestrially produced content? We're just not sure. And so understand as you begin to pay more attention to this, that these numbers are going to be very variable because people are still struggling with the question of what do we measure. There are over 2.5 million objects connected to each other in one way or another by satellite communications as part of the Internet of Things. That's good news and bad news. It means that things could go terribly wrong if a satellite suddenly ceases to function. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of redundancy built into that, but it gives you an idea of how deep the penetration is. Most of these objects are in the private sector. Most of these objects are being used by private citizens. You know, like my furnace is connected to an electronic thermostat, and I've got fire detectors in the house that are connected by the internet. In my case, that's ground-based internet. In many people's cases, especially in more isolated areas, that's space-based internet. This whole sector is very challenged by increasing demand for data. You know, we are very hungry for data. We're looking for areas of the electromagnetic spectrum we haven't even come close to exploiting before because they handle more data. And in fact, pretty soon you're going to see some of this data carried by light. It's still a little bit off, but you could literally be connected to light transmission, and the lights in this room could actually be transmitting data to you. The amount of data we're hungry for is insanely large. Satellites help in filling in that gap, especially in the third world, where the infrastructure is not as robust as it is in the developed world. This area is very disrupted by low Earth orbit small sat technologies. Those are technologies you're reading a lot about that are sort of filling low Earth orbit with objects that seem to be very reflective, so the astronomers aren't happy. It's also an area that is fairly crowded. Now, fairly crowded is relative to what it was in the past. Remember the apparent surface area of the sphere at 350 to 500 miles above Earth is much larger than the surface area of planet Earth. I mean, just, you know, larger radius, etc. But this is still chaotic. We're not controlling this area well. So we're really aiming in the direction of air traffic, space traffic control. simply because of the amount of stuff we're putting in the orbits. But these small sat technologies are critical to poorer countries because it enables them to have much robust systems. The political sensitivity to SATCOM is high. Why? Because it's possible to transmit directly to people and give them a message the government didn't want them to hear. And that's part of the controversy that is going on worldwide right now. So the next area that has a lot of business in it is position, navigation, and timing. Now, you probably think of this as just GPS. That's the way in the US and in much of the world we talk about these combinations. But it is really important that we not forget that last piece, timing. Without going into the technology, I'll tell you, your navigation doesn't work unless the timing structure on the satellites is perfect. And it's not only perfect the way you might think about your watch being in sync, it has to be perfect relativistically, because at 17,500 miles an hour of orbital speed, you need to account for the effect of relativity on the speed of on the apparent speed of light. Okay, so timing is really important here. There are many non-US technologies. We're not alone. GPS still dominates this field, but GLONASS, the Russian, Beidou, the Chinese, Galileo, European, IRNSS, a regional Indian system, and Mitsubishi, the Japanese regional system, all exist. In part because nobody wants to be fully dependent on another country for this. Anybody in here know that they have a GLONASS receiver on them? Anybody have a smartphone? You've got a GLONASS receiver. It's primarily a GPS receiver, but beginning in probably 10 years ago, Apple began putting GLONASS receivers in addition, which means you get 8 satellites on your fix, much, much, much more precise than you do with the 5 max that you would get with just a GPS system. And that is sort of interesting. How long before we also have Beidou or Galileo on the system? Not sure, but each one of those additions is a commercial private product. They're not produced by governments. Those receivers are a private space industry, and they are a rapidly growing private space industry. Market size here, same caveat, tough to fully measure what you should count, but it's roughly $75 billion. You know, government probably spends that much in a day, but this is rapidly growing, estimated to be growing in the vicinity of 10% a year. Not too bad a deal. A key thing to remember about this technology that helps you understand why it's such an interesting business is that it does far more than just navigate you. Your cell phones would cease to function well within a day to 2 if this system went out, because the cell towers synchronize their timing using this system. And the way they know where you are relative to one tower or another, so they can hand you off from tower to tower, is the timing it takes for the ping signal from the tower to get to your phone and back. And that way they say, oh, this guy's in Boulder, but he's on his way down 93. Let me see. Well, we're not going to cover him for at least 2 miles because there's that dead zone on 93. But then we're going to pick him up with a cell tower near Arvada someplace. They know where you are because of the timing, and the timing has to be precise. It just has to be right on top of things. This is very sensitive politically, not just sensitive. Why? Because if you can figure out exactly where something is, guess what you can do? You can target it. Now, that's good news and bad news. There were fewer collateral civilian casualties in the first Gulf War than in any conflict prior in part because they were able to very precisely target where they were going to do nasty things. The problem is it also enables you to say, well, if I could target a military site, I could target a civilian site. And so people are worried about that. You can imagine that people are particularly unhappy about being able to know exactly where the White House is or exactly where Putin's office is in the Kremlin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Earth observation, often referred to as remote sensing. Right up the road, Digital Globe has a major facility in Longmont. They have a headquarters in Westminster. Don't think this is all far, far away from home. And they are a major player in selling images of planet Earth for people in land use planning, prospecting, archaeology. Let's just linger here on one idea that has huge commercial implications that we don't think about very much. A lot of archaeology is troubled by the fact it's hard to find where hidden things are hidden. And yet from space, you can detect differences in land density. You can detect historical movement of sand and dirt, for example. But the most amazing archaeology story of the last 10 or 15 years that tells you why archaeologists buy Earth observation images was a discovery in Mexico of an entire Mexican city, pre-Aztec Mayan culture city, that was completely overrun by a large forest with a high canopy. Well, how did they find this thing? They found it because spectrography, the ability to take a picture and then analyze from the light what the minerals are reflected in that light, led them to see that the chemical signature of what they were looking at in the leaf tops of those trees included the chemistry of a whitewash that we knew had been used by the Maya. The trees had sucked it right out of the ground, and there it was in the top of the canopy. And right now, there is an active archaeological investigation of a site that was so hidden that it was never plundered. It was never robbed. So there is a huge market for all sorts of services. You don't get that kind of data from airplane Earth observation because you got to be in the right place. You get it to some extent from the serendipity of having large scale images that enable you to see a significant piece of the Earth's surface. So the market here, roughly 5 billion. That's the commercial market. Governments buy a lot of this stuff. As you can imagine, espionage would find this extraordinarily useful. But the commercial market's about 5 billion, struggling a little more than the other areas to find ways to market this, again, because it is hugely sensitive politically. Nasty people would love to have a perfect picture of the White House and the ellipse and be able to use it for all sorts of nefarious purposes. And I imagine there are people that would want nefarious purposes in Russia or China as well. So it's hugely sensitive politically. Space resources. This is an area I've done a lot of writing and publishing and working in. Let's just say this is an emerging possibility more than a complete market, but we know that there is a huge potential in the mineral content of pieces of rock that are flying within, let's say, 1 million miles of Earth. Now, we're also very interested in this because everything we learn about mining some of that rock helps us to avoid that rock banging into us. The old joke is the dinosaurs went extinct because they didn't have a space program. So the reality is that this whole area is intriguing and there are multiple potential cash flows in it. The primary cash flow is this notion of the big payday. You know, you get a rock that's bigger than Bear Mountain, and it's loaded with platinum grade metals. You know, as long as you don't completely depress the Earth-based market, you could have a fairly decent amount of money out of that. I understand that's not going to be easy, but other areas are even more interesting. Water. Extraordinarily interesting. Mining sunlight in a world where there's no atmosphere in the way. This is how we will run space colonies. We're not going to need fossil fuel, friends. And what we'll learn about solar power in that environment will come back to improve what we can do with solar power on planet Earth. There's a virtuous circle here, but there's a market for that. And the key is no current revenue streams. Estimates are pretty high. And there is a very high potential for losing lots of money. This is what inspired people like Richard Branson to say at one point, the easiest way to become a millionaire in the space business, start off as a billionaire. Okay. Good. See, you wanted comedy, you got some comedy. Okay, space transportation. This is sort of the big piece. This is, it's a lot easier to get pictures of rockets being launched. Every once in a while, you get a great picture of a rocket blowing itself to smithereens. The fact is, these are challenging things to build. Earth may be a pale blue dot in the sky as seen from Saturn, but it's also a very dense planet. Its gravity well is pretty deep. It's hard to get off this planet. And so we are, in fact, struggling to advance technology. We're still using rocket technology that would have been understood by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian who first presented the world with the rocket equation, the equation that says, hey, you need an awful lot more fuel, a weight of fuel than the weight of payload you're taking to space. I mean, it's really expensive. And so reusable boosters are emerging as a very commercial approach. And so reusable boosters are boosters where you don't have to throw it away. Who wants to throw away a 747 every time you fly to Paris? And yet, that's in essence what we have done historically. Commercial space can't afford that kind of loss, and it's been working to recover boosters. And that's true with SpaceX. It's true with Blue Origin. It is actually now appearing to be true with Rocket Labs. It's recovered 3 of its boosters out of 26 separate launches. Lots of interesting things going on. These companies are all involved in trying to move launch forward. They're all making money launching, but they're having a lot of trouble making a lot of money because it's a very expensive business. About a $13 billion business. We're a lot closer to the estimate with 13 billion than we are with the others. It either launches or it blows up or not. The political sensitivity here is off the charts. It's off the charts, obviously, because you could make missiles with nuclear warheads with anything that you could launch a payload with. I mean, that's the reality. It's the kitchen knife problem. It's a tool under most circumstances. It's a weapon of domestic violence and others. And so the issue of how do we keep the technology moving forward so we can go to space without having it be destructive. Economy of scale is elusive. Launching enough launches to make it work, to make the bottom line work, has been tough. But we're launching more and more now, and that is happening. Of course, some concepts are more speculative than others. Here's the Enterprise being carried on the back of a 747, probably highly impixelated because obviously we don't want you to know what technology we use to actually develop this. Space tourism. Big news. Big news. Exciting news because people are going to space who wouldn't otherwise have been able to go to space because they weren't anointed government astronauts. Big news because billionaires seem to be driving this. Which, on the one hand is sort of sad, but, it wasn't the unwashed poor that first made steamship transits across the Atlantic. It wasn't the unwashed poor who flew across the Atlantic. In fact, only 20% of the human population has ever flown in an airplane. So 80% of the population either can't afford it or has decided that they don't want to just hang in the air for that amount of time. The advanced deposits prove there's a market, but we don't know how big the market is yet. I suspect the early market will be people who want to be the only ones at the cocktail party bragging about going to space. But, many of you in this town know Alan Stern. Alan Stern was one of the first real committed planetary scientists to begin booking scientific payloads on flights that weren't even ready to fly yet, because he knew he could get aboard them for less money and faster than he could get manifested on a government flight. So, like so many things, there's puts and takes here. There is expanded access to overview effect. As we celebrate peace today, we're not sure what this might mean, but we know that hundreds of astronauts have come back from space with a different perspective on planet Earth, both on its environment and on its politics, because you don't see political boundaries from space, and you do see the fragility of Earth from space. More people are going to have access to that. And frankly, if some of the richer people have been more resistant to some of the climate change understandings, maybe sending more of them to space will help. Maybe if we left a few of them in space, it would help. So each flight actually helps to launch an economy of scale. So what do we see in the future? Well, we see something like what is up there on the far right, communities that are using lunar material plus other materials probably either extracted from the moon and processed to actually live there and work there. We can definitely expect some high-profile bankruptcies. Deep space industries, whether it's bankrupt or not bankrupt, it sort of sold itself at a point where it wasn't able to pay its bills otherwise. OneWeb filed bankruptcy. Intelsat, a name you may well have already heard, is just coming out of bankruptcy. So you're going to see a lot. This is a place you can lose money. Expect it. And that's okay, because each one of those places that goes bankrupt is money the government didn't lose. Expect a lot of small and medium enterprise entrants. This is a really exciting new development. People that don't need a lot of outside capital, who are making a niche product that is increasingly critical to someone else's spacecraft. That's called supply chain. A lot of you folks made your living in supply chain. This is beginning to happen in space. Expect innovation to outpace invention. Now that sounds a little weird from a space geek like me. The reality is, take a look at air-launched spacecraft. Spacecraft that are dropped from airplanes, so you can get them 35,000 feet in the air using air density without having to fight against it. Then you drop them in much less dense air and they take off in a single stage and go to orbit. It's a wonderful way to use less propellant, be less polluting, and they have less cost. The fact is, the invention in that area was Stratolaunch, the most amazing airplane you might have ever seen. Twin-hulled, a wingspan that went from like Los Angeles to San Francisco. Absolutely enormous airplane, could have taken 250 tons to 35,000 feet and launched it into orbit. The competing technology was Sir Richard Branson, who used the 747 to do almost the same thing. I think he's limited around 150 to 200 tons. Well, why was that innovation? It's because he realized that the original 747 was built to have an external fuel tank. And that external fuel tank still had the fitting on every 747 because it was too expensive to redesign the plane. And so now that external fuel tank fitting is what he hangs his Virgin Orbit rocket from, and has successfully tested that rocket's ability to take a payload into space. Innovation and commerce go hand in hand because it's the way you sort of stay ahead of competition if you're playing the game for real. Understand spin in will be as important as spin off. That is, bringing ideas from terrestrial activity into the space sector will be as important as spin off. But spin off is going to teach us things. If any of you have ever been asked to do high impact aerobics to deal with osteoporosis, for example, guess what? We discovered that in space. We discovered that would be helpful. Resistive exercise is now critical for all astronauts because women get osteoporosis on Earth about 5 to 8 times, somewhere in that area, more often than men. But astronauts came back with osteoporotic symptoms equally independent of their gender. Well, guess what? Gravity, folks. And we found a way to use gravity to help to reduce the effects of osteoporosis. And there are lots of other examples. Expect markets to develop off Earth. Expect markets to develop off Earth. We're going to have people on the moon. We're going to have people in orbit more frequently. That will become a market, not tomorrow, within 10 to 20 years. Certainly at 20, I would expect it. Expect Colorado to be among the biggest players. Colorado, depending on how you count the numbers, is first, second, or third in private commercial space in the United States of America, which is by far and away the farthest advanced of any commercial space endeavor in the world. Colorado, Boulder, Longmont, Westminster, all the way down to Colorado Springs. I mean, basically Fort Collins to Colorado Springs is a space card. And yeah, pretty important. But there's one last point, and you absolutely can never forget that these opportunities may be the best space to be on a future afternoon. Thank you.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. And I'd like to celebrate you from the point of view of Leonardo da Vinci. So many times today, we have specialists in silos who shout past each other and engage in parallel play. But you have connected the silos and connected the dots and made for a specialist and a generalist. And I hope your policy considerations help us to make decisions going into the future. And one of those decisions we made in Rotary over 35 years ago, as you know, as a member of the club, was to eradicate polio. And we're very, very close, clearly, not quite there. But in your honor, we want to donate 100 doses of polio vaccine to the Polio Plus campaign. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, man.